This is more of like an emotional opinion about lakes, but I think they're an important part of our identity. I don't think UW or the city would be the same without our beautiful lakes.
I think one of the great things about living in the Midwest is having lots of sources of fresh water.
Only 3% of water on Earth is fresh water. And most of that 3% is unavailable because it's tied up in the atmosphere, or it's too deep in the soil for us to access, or it's stored in glaciers and we just can't access it. Organisms that live in freshwater cannot survive in salty water, and vice versa. So there's that biological impact of just changing what's going on within that ecosystem.
Especially with Lake Mendota, the way that it's changed chemically over the years makes it a less viable habitat.
The riparian zone is the area immediately surrounding freshwater that you want to be full of native plant life. So here in Wisconsin, maybe a nice prairie or, some nice wetland plants surrounding the freshwater could really help to filter out pollutants that are coming through. My name is Linnea Rock. I am a second-year master's student in the Dugan Lab at the UW Center for Limnology. I worked for a few years at the Wisconsin DNR in the Water Quality Bureau, and I worked specifically on contamination type projects, so looking at mercury, chloride, phosphorus, nitrogen. My project in the Dugan Lab is looking at the Upper Yahara River watershed, which contains lakes Mendota and Monona. I monitor the tributaries, the rivers entering and exiting those lakes, and the lakes themselves for chloride year-round. Salt pollution is the cause of chloride pollution in our waters here. Chloride cannot be easily removed from fresh water through our normal wastewater treatment practices. I collect conductivity data, which measures the amount of ions in the water. In this system, the main thing that drives changes in conductivity is salt. Since the 1940s, which is when road salt became a widespread practice here in Wisconsin, we've seen a definite increasing trend in our lakes, and especially in our lakes in urban areas of Wisconsin, like Madison.
Lake Mendota is what we'd call a dimictic lake, which means that it mixes 2 times a year.
So when there's a lot of wind and the air temperature is changing and the water temperature is changing, the lake starts to mix. And that's a really important process for recycling nutrients and getting oxygen from the top of the lake, down to the bottom.
This mixing happens because the lake will stratify, which means that it separates into 2 layers.
Saltwater is much denser than freshwater. So if you get a bottom layer of salt that is too dense to mix with the rest of the column, that can have really adverse effects for that important process.
There's cool chemistry that happens kind of at that interface between the 2 layers.
And lake dynamics, of course, play a really important role in how pollutants move and are cycled. And it could just have these cascading effects down through the food web.
Anything that goes down the storm sewers goes straight to the lake. If you have a bunch of leaves sitting in the street, they decompose into whatever they're made up of, which is carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, a lot of the same elements that make up most living beings. I'm Marissa Kinnear. I'm a PhD student in the environmental chemistry program at UW-Madison. Currently, I'm doing some work on Lake Mendota. It's really high sulfur concentrations, which is partially due to a lot of the agriculture that happens around the lake and upstream of the lake.
We refer to sources of pollution as non-point source and point source. So point source is going to be like your sewer system that all ends up at a wastewater treatment plant. In Madison, all of the harmful algae blooms happen because of non-point source pollution coming from runoff from surrounding agricultural areas. My name is Elizabeth McDaniel. I'm a 5th year PhD student in the microbiology doctoral training program, and I am in Trina McMahon's lab. My research specifically is on using specific microorganisms and harnessing their metabolic capabilities to remove phosphorus from wastewater We use activated sludge, refers to using concentrated microorganisms to remove nutrients instead of the primary treatment of wastewater is just waiting for things to settle out and then removing what's settled out. Eutrophication is basically where you get those harmful algal blooms because of a buildup of nutrients like phosphorus.
Phosphorus and nitrogen are both important nutrients in a lake ecosystem. These are nutrients that are in human bodies as well. Organisms in the water also need nitrogen and phosphorus to function, and they are really important. The problem is when there's excessive nutrient loading, there's more than enough. The organisms don't use it all, so it gets stored in the water, it can get stored in the sediment and recirculate through the water and cause what many people are probably seeing, harmful algal blooms, big green mats that cover our lakes in the summer.
Anytime we have one of those big algae blooms, when that algae goes away, it sinks to the bottom of the lake and starts decomposing. And that process uses up oxygen in the water, which is what fish like to breathe, just like we do. A lot of my work is actually focused back in the lab, running an inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometer, which is just a fancy instrument that we use to measure metal and sulfur concentrations in the water. Metals can tell us a lot kind of about different chemical processes that are happening throughout the water column that can be associated with a lack of oxygen in certain areas. The less oxygen there is, the more hostile that environment becomes for certain fish species. There are certain species that are more tolerant of it than others. More popular game fish are less tolerant to those depleted oxygen concentrations.
The main exposure pathway for people to mercury is through fish. Mercury accumulates in your body over time. Once you ingest methylmercury, which is the organic form, you usually don't excrete it, and it just builds up in your body over the course of your life.
My name is Amber. I am a third-year PhD student here at UW-Madison.
For my master's, I was working on mercury cycling in a freshwater estuary in Duluth. So mercury is typically considered an inorganic contaminant. What's interesting about mercury is that it can be converted from the inorganic form to the organic form, and then it becomes really toxic in the organic form. So methylmercury looks structurally similar to a couple amino acids, and so your body picks it up and is like, oh, I need this because it's an amino acid, and it just builds it into your nervous system. Also, there's a lot of things that control how much mercury can be converted into this organic form in the environment, like is there oxygen present, is there sulfate present, is there carbon present, etc. So the mechanism of getting from the less toxic to the most toxic form is harder to pinpoint, but that process is mediated by microbes that just exist in the environment. And so basically I looked at inorganic mercury, oxygen, carbon, sulfur, all of those things to figure out where is the mercury being converted into methylmercury in this system. The areas that were usually anoxic most of the time, had a lot of carbon, had a lot of sulfide building up, were the ones that were producing the most methylmercury. With mercury, there are just ambient mercury emissions in the air, usually from fossil fuels, which are, I guess, human derived, but usually the mercury is deposited into the water far away from the source of the actual emission of mercury. The work that I do now is looking at herbicides and organic contaminants that are intentionally put in the water by humans. The area of science that I work in is herbicides that are used to kill invasive plants in lakes, but the herbicides I study are used in agriculture and can easily run off into waterways as well. And so if you're releasing that into the environment, you're not only going to kill the thing you wanted to kill, but you might end up killing things that you didn't intend to kill. So removing a bunch of plants that you didn't intend to remove can have effects on nutrient uptake and nutrient concentrations in the lake, or fish habitat options, or macroinvertebrate habitat options. And so it's a balance where having an invasive species that can be very destructive to a shoreline if it grows out of control can have negative effects on the lake. But if you kill all the plants in the lake, it will also have a negative effect on the lake. And so the work that I do is looking at how exactly are these chemicals being degraded in the lakes so we know how much to add and we don't undershoot or overshoot that dosing recommendation. How do you classify a contaminant? Because we're applying an herbicide on purpose.
PFAS is an acronym that stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. And these are a huge group of man-made compounds, and we as a society use them for a ton of different things. My name is Sarah Belgoyan, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at UW-Madison. The project that I'm working on is looking at PFAS in lakes. At least some of these compounds are harmful to human health, meaning that they can cause cancer in some cases, thyroid issues, high cholesterol, a host of different negative health outcomes. My project specifically looks at PFAS that gets into Lake Michigan, look at PFAS contributions to the lake, looking at tributaries that lead into the lake, and trying to see, are there different sources of PFAS that maybe we don't know about that are contributing to contamination. There isn't a current problem with PFAS in Lake Michigan, but what I'm hoping to do with this project is to, continue to protect the lake. Some of the main things that contribute to environmental PFAS pollution, one is firefighting foams. For the past 5 or 6 decades, we've been using this kind of military grade firefighting foam that contains PFAS. Other things are like chrome plating or other metal plating. So a lot of the big sources are from industry. It's not you or I, like what we do at home. That's not where a lot of the PFAS comes from to the environment. So PFAS is in consumer goods like your Teflon coated pans. So a lot of the nonstick pans have PFAS in them, and you can ingest them then. Also through your waterproof clothing, things like that tend to have PFAS in it, and they can form dust, and you can ingest or inhale them that way. So there are a ton of different exposure routes. As a consumer, you can kind of try and minimize your own PFAS exposure by not purchasing those products, or kind of doing a little bit of research to find what doesn't include PFAS. The reason why environmental PFAS exposure is so important is because you don't have that option. If there's PFAS in the lakes, like say in Madison, or say there's PFAS in your drinking water, there's not a lot you can do about it. You can't decide not to buy that because it's what you have. Another way that people can come in contact with PFAS from lakes is by consuming fish. For PFAS, they are going to accumulate in those fish. And so if you're eating that fish, you can get a pretty high dose of PFAS if those fish are contaminated. Other ways, it's just through recreation. I mean, if people are out swimming in the water, they might consume some of the water that might be high in PFAS. And this is not just true for PFAS, it's true for a lot of different kinds of pollution. It can form foam on a water body, but foam can also just form on its own naturally. And even then, the PFAS will kind of concentrate in that foam. So there are a couple ways to treat it in the field to try and remove it from the tributary. It's harder to clean something up once it's been released. It's a lot easier to try and minimize it. We've kind of known that PFAS is harmful for a while now, but there aren't any federal regulations. And so kind of as we speak, the states are trying to decide what their state regulations are going to be. They're coming up with a plan for what the state is going to do in terms of regulation, in terms of how they're going to handle contaminated sites, different things. You can sign up for email lists from the DNR, and they're always asking for feedback.
It's important that people who aren't scientists understand about lake dynamics so that they understand what their part is in helping with that. For the last, 4 years, I've been volunteering with the Rock River Coalition, which is just a group of citizen scientists. The organization works kind of hand in hand with the DNR. And it's kind of a way for the DNR to expand their nutrient monitoring. The Rock River watershed is where they're focused, but it kind of covers the whole chain of lakes in southern central Wisconsin.
We look at the flow, how deep the stream is. We collect invertebrates that are there to try and use as an indicator of how clean the water is. This data is really helpful for watershed managers to know, okay, we have a phosphorus problem over here, or, you know, we have too much suspended sediment in this part of the watershed. Like, how do we curb that? Because it's moving nutrients, it could be moving pollutants, etc., into a different part of the watershed we're trying to protect.
By kind of employing all these citizen scientists along with the DNR scientists, they can get more data more frequently on the nutrients in these streams that feed into the chain of lakes.
To have information about the baseline quality and health of any water body is incredible when you realize something is wrong with it.
You don't have to be a scientist in order to like get involved in that way in a citizen science group like that, and just doing what you can to like learn the most you can about different environments. And it's a lot of fun.
As we experience the effects of climate change over time, having clean sources of water and having new technologies for using our water resources sustainably is going to be really important.
The biggest thing that I advise to people is just to use less salt on your driveway and sidewalk. That's something that every person in Wisconsin can do to help prevent this problem of increased salinization. Most people use more. They think if I lay down more salt, it's going to be safer, and that's not necessarily true. Below around 15 degrees Fahrenheit, salt doesn't even work anymore. For road de-icing, brining is something that has started to gain popularity. It performs better than rock salt in most scenarios, and it allows you to use up to 40% less rock salt.
The biggest issue that we have with Lake Mendota is these large algae blooms, and those happen because of excess nutrients. Your yard will do a decent amount of filtering of the nutrients that leach from leaves, but leaving them piled up in the street before a big rainstorm is a no-no.
Most of the things that we can do to stop mercury contamination right now stem from cutting back on our use of fossil fuels. That's really all it's going to be. For the herbicides, so there's actually a lot of recommendations that I think homeowners and citizens can make on that front. Anything that's going to go in a lake, make sure it is clean before you put it into another lake. We wouldn't have to be using herbicides in lakes to treat invasive species if we weren't moving invasive species into lakes. The best way to not have to treat your lake is to not introduce an invasive species.
I hope that my research will inform government agencies that are working to protect the water quality here. And I hope that it helps the community to understand better, what's happening to our lakes, because small changes within the community can make a big difference.
Humans will get some kind of recreational value, but also the sentimental and spirit feeding value of the lake. The reason it's the most studied lake in the world is because the people who study lakes invented the study of lakes in Madison.